Hello, everyone. This is Jim Melvin of Clemson University, and thank you for watching my webinar. This is a re-recording of my original webinar held on February 10th, which, because of a technical glitch, did not record. Famed Southern author Ron Rash starred in the Q&A for that one, but his portion also did not record. So Ron won't be here for this one. However, there is a short video about Ron at the end that will at least give you a taste of what he is about. So let's get started. Here's my webinar, part 2. How to start and finish a novel. You know you've always wanted to write one. Here's how to actually do it. So allow me to introduce myself. And if you have any questions for me afterward, feel free to contact me by email or phone. Since January 2015, I have been a writer at Clemson University in the Public Service and Agriculture's Communications Department. Before joining Clemson, I was a longtime journalist at several major newspapers, including the St. Petersburg Times and the Charlotte Observer. But I've also written 6 published novels and 3 more that are currently being shopped by an agent. My 6-book epic fantasy series, The Death Wizard Chronicles, has been published by Bellbridge Books, a mid-sized house based in Memphis, Tennessee. The concept for this webinar arose from a conversation I had with Keith Robinson of Purdue University at last year's ACE conference in Charleston. So I want to emphasize that this webinar is not just about selling my books. However, if anyone out there is interested, I want to make it clear that my series contains adult content. This is not Harry Potter, it's more like Game of Thrones. So it is not appropriate for children. But if you're an adult who loves action-packed epic fantasy, then The Death Wizard Chronicles fits the bill as a magical tale that is filled with dragons, monsters, swords, and sorcery. So, like 99% of novelists, I am not a millionaire, but I have written more than 1 million words of fiction. So though I'm not the most qualified person to teach you how to become an international sensation, I am qualified to provide a few tips on how to not just start a novel, but far more importantly, to finish one. So wake up. Here's where the real work begins. Do your research up front. Before I wrote the first word of my epic fantasy series, I had been envisioning the series for many years. You see, I wrote a book, a horror novel, when I was 20 years old. It was never published, but I didn't really care. My second book was going to be my ticket to success. Only I got married, started having kids, worked a stressful job, bought a house, mowed the yard, blah, blah, blah. And 25 years later, there still was no second book, except in the recesses of my mind where it was darn near written word for word. When I finally decided to get serious and actually write my series, I first spent about 3 months doing upfront research. I read exactly 75 nonfiction books on everything from medieval armor to horses for dummies. I also interviewed several people about various subjects and took an hours-long nature walk in the Appalachian Mountains with a well-known naturalist, hammering him with questions about the landscape, the flora, the lakes and rivers, and anything else I could think of. Anyone who has read epic fantasy knows that there tends to be a lot of walking around the wilds. So I use my research to help me create vivid settings. So I recommend that you write what you know. This phrase will get some eyes rolling, but for a first-time novelist especially, I believe that this is vital. We've all heard the dreaded words writer's block. Well, it's my opinion that this is most often caused by a lack of knowledge of the subject matter. Now, it's sort of difficult to know epic fantasy, but I have read hundreds of fantasy novels and series and have researched just about every topic that might relate to this genre. Personally, I would never try to write a detective novel. That doesn't mean I couldn't have a brief scene with a detective in it, but I don't have the knowledge to write a novel with a detective as a main character. So don't write a detective novel if you've never been inside a police station, unless You're willing to do a ton of research that brings you up to speed. Part of knowing can be having read hundreds of fiction and nonfiction books about the genre you've chosen. If you write what you know, your first novel will be much easier to finish. So, outline or no outline. As I mentioned earlier, I spent years envisioning my series before I wrote it. I'm talking literally thousands of hours playing and replaying scenes in my head. So when I finally sat down to write, it was as if I was channeling. At times, the words poured out of me almost faster than I could type. This is one way, though a very time-consuming way, to avoid needing an outline. But even then, I maintained a very detailed timeline of events, considering that my series contains dozens of characters and takes place over the course of a year. So, outline or no outline? This depends a lot on your personality type. Some people cannot write a word without first creating a full-blown outline. Others get sick to their stomachs just typing the word outline. What's more important is that you are organized. Very few writers have the ability to successfully write freeform without substantial organization backing them up. Other ways to be organized: think about your novel so much that you literally memorize an outline in your head. Instead of an outline, use a timeline and update the timeline as you go along. This is especially important for novels that juggle the actions, movements, and growth of a variety of characters, and make detailed lists of characters, settings, plot lines, etc. POV is what makes fiction tick. Point of view is crucial to the success of a novel, as well as being crucial to getting published. There is not enough time here for a detailed discussion on POV, but I highly recommend, as part of your research up front, that you read several books on POV. They are readily available and are fabulous teaching tools. I am a fan of past tense third person limited for your first novel. Publishers love it, and it has few limitations. Using this method, the narrator knows only the thoughts of a single character. However, you're able to switch narrators between chapters and/or scene breaks. An excellent example of third person limited is George R.R. Martin's Game of Thrones series. But regardless of what POV you choose, be certain to understand how it works, why you're using it, and then be consistent and thorough. Whether you're using third person, first person, objective, omniscient, there's nothing more amateurish than a novelist messing up his or her POV. And now for the most basic, but perhaps most valuable advice I have to give. Keep a calendar. Regardless of how routine or hectic your lifestyle might be, you should keep a detailed calendar of when you're going to write and for how long, and then do it. Whether you're sick, bored, in a bad mood, whatever. If you stick to your calendar, the word count will pile up. I recommend setting up 2 sessions a day, one for writing and a second for editing what you've most recently written. That way, when you sit down to write, you can get to it and not waste your actual writing time on editing. When I was working on my series, I wrote from 8 p.m. to midnight 7 days a week, and then I edited from 11 a.m. to noon 7 days a week. In this way, I was able to write a 750,000-word, 6-book series, including 15 revisions of each book in 3 years. This is no world record. Some novelists can churn out one a month, but it was still pretty impressive, and I owe it all to my calendar. This next slide carries on the concept of keeping a calendar. You muse, you lose. Do not wait for the mood to strike. Only a rare few geniuses can write when they feel like it and have great success. The rest of us have to write come rain or shine. Sometimes the words will flow with gleeful ease, but other times they will cause you as much agony as a 24-hour flu. Doesn't matter. If it's on your calendar to write from 8 p.m. to 11 p.m., do it. Excuses are for losers. However, Permit yourself the luxury of writing crap. You don't have to get it perfect the first time. That's why we revise it, to eventually get it right. As I mentioned earlier, I revised each of my Death Wizard Chronicles novels 15 times. No lie. That being said, I don't want to hear any jokes about how I should have done 16 or more revisions. And now for one final topic before we proceed to the Q&A. And this is the most nebulous point I will make, but it might give you some food for thought. Find your voice. Whether writing a 750,000 word series or a 500 word media release, I use the same voice. In other words, I allow the words to pour out of me rather than trying to force them out. It's like swimming across the smooth surface of a crystal clear lake. Don't fight it. Go with the flow and take pleasure in the rhythm. For better or worse, my voice belongs to me, and I do trust it. Following are 3 examples that illustrate how my voice translates from story to story. Keep in mind, however, that these examples are taken out of context. In reality, an author earns his or her voice starting with the very first few words. This is an excerpt from Fords and Death, Book 1 of my series, The Death Wizard Chronicles. When darkness came, the storm fell upon the mountain like a fiend. Sobota had never felt such ferocious winds or heard such thunder. She feared she might not make it to the top of the bulwark, much less reach the pit. To make matters worse, it was wickedly cold. Ice crystals spun in the air like a million miniature daggers, obscuring the moon and stars. Frequent blasts of lightning provided fleeting moments of visibility, during which she looked about in all directions, studying her surroundings. As she peered from her hiding place, hail pelted her. The wall above her was coated with a glaze of ice. Would she have to wait out the storm before attempting her ascent? This is an excerpt from a piece I wrote for the Clemson research magazine Glimpse, titled Sweet Hope for Sapelo Island. Doc Bill loads his truck and heads toward Hog Hammock along a bumpy dirt road, eventually reaching one of the island's only paved thoroughfares. Sapelo's residents have named this road the Autobahn, after the famous series of highways in Germany, some of which have no speed limit. Sapelo's version of the Autobahn does have a speed limit, 25. And while Germany's Autobahn is swarming with traffic, Sapelo's is as quiet as a secluded country trail. Towering trees laced with Spanish moss form natural bulwarks on each side of the road that are so thick only spears of sparkling light can pierce them. Rather than press on the gas and go 90 miles per hour, the urge is to step on the brake, pull off to the side, and enjoy the view. Irony can most certainly be delicious. And this is an excerpt from a media release I wrote titled War of Wills, Clemson Goats Battle Invasive Plants. Armed with teeth, horns, and cloven hooves, a herd of heroes has raced to Clemson University's rescue, bravely confronting marauding invaders who have held a creek hostage for decades. Dozens of hungry goats, immune to poison ivy and oak and impervious to the sharpest of thorns, have clomped heedlessly into dense tangles of invasive plants, choking the banks and adjacent areas of Honeycutt Creek, where we see kudzu, goats, see dinner. I hope these examples show that it's possible to be lyrical in everything from 125,000 word novels to 5,000 word magazine articles to 500 word media releases. This doesn't mean that all stories need to be told in this fashion. Certainly, the nuts and bolts are exactly what is needed in many, if not most cases, at least when it comes to writing media releases. I'm just saying that there are often opportunities to have some fun, no matter how mundane the subject matter might at first appear to be. So the next time you sit down to write, take a few moments to think about your voice. which includes, of course, playing to your strengths. Then, don't think about it anymore. Instead, step aside and let the words do the work. And that's how I'll conclude this webinar. I hope that at least some of what I've said will be helpful to any aspiring novelists out there. Following is a slide that I've included that provides a bio of Ron Rash. Again, his live Q&A session did not record, which is a shame because he said some fascinating things and was very gracious. However, a video of Ron will follow this last slide. Ron Rash is one of the South's most decorated and respected authors. He has spent his life exploring the Carolinas, both in real life and on the pages of his books. His family traces his southern roots back to the mid-1700s. Shown here are some of his accomplishments. I want to thank everyone for watching this webinar, and I hope you enjoyed it. And to conclude, here is a short video shot by Clemson University's Ashley Jones of Ron discussing his grandfather's role in his life. It is quite touching.
People ask how I became a writer. There are a number of influences, but one that certainly rings true is an event when I was 5 years old. My grandfather read to me. I had a copy of The Cat in the Hat. My mom and dad had read to me a number of times, but one afternoon I asked him to read it, and he took the book up, put me in his lap, and started turning the pages and telling me a story. It was very different from the one that my parents had read from the same book. And I liked that story. I liked the idea that this cat was having a different adventure. And then next time I saw him, I asked him to read it, and once again, the story was different. Cat got into more trouble, out of it a little less easily. And I just found that amazing that this story could keep changing. And I think it was the first time I had a sense of words, as if they could be magical, they could transform and move around. And it would be a couple of years later I'd realized that he had done that because he could not read or write. So my grandfather could not teach me how to read, but he had taught me how to use my imagination, and I will always be grateful for what he taught me.